A man rebuilt from ruin falls into a galaxy that was never designed for mercy. The air here is older than mercy, thicker than mercy, and it tastes of iron and incense and the exhalations of a god who has not spoken in 10,000 years. He has served an emperor who demanded everything and gave nothing back but survival. In Warhammer 40,000, there is an emperor on a throne who has done the same to an entire civilization, and who cannot refuse, and who cannot stop. The question is not whether the Dark Lord of the Sith will survive a galaxy that runs on suffering. The question is what he becomes when he recognizes it. Methion had been dead for 10 million years. That was not poetic language. That was the precise record its own systems still maintained, carved into the geological memory of a world that had forgotten weather, forgotten wind, forgotten the biological noise that living planets make when life uses them as a substrate. The atmospheric processes had ground to dust before the Imperium of Man had taken its first steps on holy terror. The cities, if they had ever been cities, had compressed under geological time into flat plains of glass and ferrocrete and something harder than either, a material that did not exist in any standard template, construct archived anywhere in the Menachonis's vast and jealous libraries. The sky above Methion was the color of an old bruise, purple-black where the distant sun managed to reach it, absolute dark everywhere else. No wind moved across the plains. No weather formed over the plains, because there was no moisture to form weather with, and nothing alive to generate the thermal differentials that weather requires. The planet's axial rotation was so glacially slow it barely qualified as rotation at all, and so one hemisphere baked in perpetual half-light while the other froze in absolute darkness. And Methion cared about neither because Methion had not cared about anything in a very long time. Below the surface, however, something had been listening. It listened without urgency. Urgency was a property of organic things, a biological feature of systems that could run out of time, and the things beneath Methion had not been organic in any meaningful sense for longer than human civilization had existed in any form. They listened the way mathematics holds a theorem, with perfect passive fidelity, requiring no attention and no maintenance, simply there in the way that truth is there when no mind is present to perceive it. They had been woken once, centuries ago, by an inquisitorial probe that had crept too close to the surface apertures and burned itself out against the phase fields before anyone above ground had understood what it found. The Ordos had filed a report. The report had been classified at a level where the classification itself was classified, and the Navy patrol route that passed Methion 3 times a year had been quietly adjusted so that it passed Methion not at all. The things below had not been woken since. The thing that woke them this time was not a probe. It came in on an approach vector that violated 3 separate physical laws that the Imperium had verified through 400 years of astronomical observation. It translated out of something adjacent to real space at a velocity that could not be reduced in the time available, trailing superheated plasma and the distinctive spectral signature of a drive system that no Mechanicus Magus had ever seen and no Adeptus Mechanicus archive contained. It hit the atmosphere of Methion already breaking apart, the command shuttle's reinforced hull peeling away in long burning ribbons, the forward viewport atomizing against the thermal gradient. Every sensor array going blind simultaneously as the phase fields deep in the ground came online for the first time in 50,000 years, and reached upward with the unhurried certainty of systems that had never been in a hurry in their existence. The phase fields were not reaching for the ship. They were reaching for something inside the ship. What the phase technology felt was not the warp. It had felt the warp before, in the long centuries of the galaxy's deterioration, had sensed its corrosive proximity through Methion's upper atmosphere without engaging, because the warp was a known quantity in the Necron calculus of threats, and a known quantity that was not approaching was not a threat. This was different. This resonated against the phase matrices at a frequency that was adjacent to the warp, that moved through the same dimensional layers, but was structured differently at its core, cleaner and more precise, and the resonance it produced when it struck the sleeping systems was the resonance of a matching frequency, not heard, felt. the way a tuning fork feels the string that answers it before the string has produced any audible sound. The phase fields reached for it without thought, without decision, following the passive attunement of 10 million years of preparedness for exactly this kind of signal. They had been built to detect psychic signatures of significant magnitude. They had never been built to detect a psychic signature that operated outside the warp's logic entirely. They had never been built for anything from outside. The shuttle hit the surface. The impact was not survivable by any organic standard that the Imperium had established through extensive data collection over 10,000 years of war. The reinforced hull crumpled in a column of displaced ferrocrete, hard earth and fractured bedrock that registered on Zmic arrays, 3-star systems away as a level 4 geological event, punching through 4 geological strata in a sequence that took approximately 3 seconds, and the command module came to rest 63 meters below the surface of Methion, surrounded by stone, compressed so dense it rang like iron when the settling debris struck it. The phase fields sealed above the impact point within 2 seconds of the module's final deceleration, smoothing over the wound in the earth with the quiet efficiency of a system that had been designed to contain breaches and had never, in 10 million years of operation, failed to do so. In the darkness of the buried command module, nothing moved. Then the breathing resumed. It was not the breathing of a man. It was the breathing of a machine that maintained a man, the ventilator cycles of a suit designed to perform the biological function that a destroyed body could no longer perform for itself. The rhythm was metronomic, precisely metronomic. It filled the silence of the sealed module like a timepiece marking the seconds in a tomb where seconds were the only currency left. Emergency lighting flickered twice and then steadied into dim red bands along the forward console. The forward console showed nothing. Every sensor showed nothing. There was only rock in every direction and the specific quality of silence that rock makes when it has been disturbed and then resettled, which is to say, absolute silence. The silence of deep geological time, undisturbed except for the mechanical precision of a life support system performing its function 30 meters per minute, below the surface of a world that had been dead since before humanity learned the word for fire. Darth Vader, Dark Lord of the Sith, the Emperor's Fist, the right hand of an empire spanning a galaxy he no longer recognized, lay in the wreckage of his command module and did not move for 11 seconds. Then he moved. He rose from the wreckage with the deliberate efficiency of something that had been assessing for those 11 seconds and had completed its assessment. The suit absorbed the impact damage across its structural components with the indifference of its engineering. Micro-fractures in 3 non-critical components of the left arm assembly. The right pauldron's outer layer had taken a compressive deformation that the suit flagged as cosmetic. The life support systems were undamaged. The lightsaber was undamaged. He ran the assessment with the discipline of a man who had learned through decades of survival that the body you operated with at the beginning of a crisis was not necessarily the body you would have at its end, and that cataloging what you had before you needed it was the difference between adaptation and improvisation. He activated the lightsaber. The red blade ignited in the darkness, and its light fell over a chamber that had not seen light in 10 million years. He was not in a natural cave. The walls were not stone, or they had been stone before something had reshaped them with a precision that stone did not reshape itself to. The corridors extending in 3 directions from his impact point were lined with a material that did not corrode and did not age, and reflected the red blade's light in patterns too geometric to be natural. The architecture was mathematical in a way that aesthetic sensibility could not fully account for. Angles that suggested a mind finding beauty in precision itself, rather than in the effects of precision. And the scale was wrong in the way of buildings designed for a purpose that no longer required occupants. Not abandoned, sleeping. There was a difference that the Force, when he reached for it, confirmed immediately. The Force was there, but it was wrong. The current that ran beneath all living things, the energy field that bound the galaxy and answered to his will with the ease of a river answering its banks, was present in this place, but it ran wrong. Thin where it should have been dense. It tasted of something cold and vast at the edges of its perception, something that occupied the same dimensional frequencies without being the same substance, and below that, deeper than the force usually had depth, something enormous turned in its sleep with the slowness of geological processes. He had felt the dark side in its most extreme expressions. He had felt battlefields soaked in the deaths of thousands, places where the force ran thick with the residue of violence and grief, and the long weight of accumulated suffering. This was different from all of those. This was something else, wearing the dark side's frequencies, the way a predator wears the markings of harmless things, patient and purposeful and enormously, appallingly old. He filed this information and moved. The scarabs found him at the second intersection. They were not large. They were the size of a clenched, gauntleted fist, each one, and there were perhaps 200 of them, moving in the fluid coordinated patterns of a system operating at the edge of instinct and calculation simultaneously. They came from the walls, from apertures he had not seen because they had not existed until the scarabs needed them, and they moved toward him with the particular silence of things that did not breathe and did not have hearts to quicken and had no fear response, because fear was a biological feature they had been engineered past. They were the maintenance systems of the vault, and they had registered an anomaly in their maintenance environment, and they were moving to address it. He did not let them reach him. The force, thin and cold, still answered the demands of someone who had been practicing for 4 decades. He reached out with his left hand and gathered the front rank of the scarabs into a compressed telekinetic ball, 43 of them, their legs still moving against nothing as they rotated in the grip of his will. And then he closed his hand, and the telekinetic grip contracted. The sound 43 Necron scarabs make when their living metal bodies are compressed past their structural tolerance is a sound with no equivalent in organic experience. A crystalline implosion, followed by the soft chiming of component fragments settling, and it carried through the vault's corridors with the clarity of a statement. The remaining scarabs stopped. They held their position at the edge of the red blade's light for exactly 3 seconds. Then, with the decisiveness of systems that had just received new information, they retreated, not fled, retreated, in good order, back to the apertures they had come from, the apertures sealing behind them, and the corridor was silent again except for the breathing and the hum. He continued moving. The vault unfolded around him in its geometric dark enormity as he went deeper, following the strongest concentration of phase energy, because the strongest concentration of phase energy meant the power source, and the power source meant, in his experience of both military infrastructure and the dark side sensitivity to concentrations of will, the controlling intelligence. Every military installation had a commanding officer. Every fortress had a keep. Every vault built to last 10 million years had something at its center that made decisions. He found it at the 3rd level down, or rather it found him. The voice came from the walls, carried through the living metal with the fidelity of a broadcast system designed for exactly this purpose, resonant and precise, and carrying beneath its mechanical perfection the ghost of something that had once been a personality, and had preserved the pattern, if not the warmth. The phase fields reacted to you, the voice said. They have not reacted to anything living in 50,000 years. He stopped, red blade up, listening with the force and listening with the suit's audio processing simultaneously. Whatever you carry, the voice continued, it shares a resonance with technologies older than your species' first tool. This is unexpected. I am interested in the unexpected. It has been some time since anything unexpected has happened. A pause, precise and deliberate. Step forward, Lord of whatever you are Lord of. You are not in danger. That, Vader said, depends on who is telling me I am not in danger. Fyron Olveket the Undying, the voice said, Lord of the Vault Eternal, last coherent mind of the Methion conclave, and the being who controls the 40,000 warriors currently holding their positions in the surrounding corridors at my express instruction, an instruction I have not yet reconsidered. A pause. Yet, he moved forward. The corridor opened into a chamber that had the dimensions of a cathedral, without any of the cathedral's symbolic furniture. a vast geometric space whose proportions suggested a throne room designed by something that had understood the concept of throne rooms intellectually and reproduced it with precision and without warmth. The throne was there, at its center, living metal grown into its base over 10 million years of stillness, and before it stood a figure that was simultaneously the room's most elaborate object and its most obviously animate one. Pharaoh Olvaket the Undying was not large in the way that made threats of size. He was taller than the Scarabs and the standard Necron warriors, but not towering, and his proportions carried the suggestion of authority in their design rather than in any physical mass. The living metal of his form had been shaped 10 million years ago into the approximation of robes and a crown, and both had grown into something beyond proportion over the centuries. The crown fused partly into the skull structure it had been placed upon, the robes having developed the slow organic patterns of something that has had time to evolve an aesthetic. His eyes were the green gold of a gaseous nebula seen through a viewport, and they regarded Vader with an attention that carried no hostility and considerable curiosity. The curiosity stumps time and reconciled the sensation with something approaching pleasure. "A man in a machine," Olvaket said, the voice from the walls, now from the figure, but not precisely from its mouth. From a modulator in its chest, vibrating the living metal with calibrated precision. "A man who chose the machine. I have not seen this in 10 million years." "I chose nothing," Vader said. "Your machine was imposed," the Overlord said. "My destruction was imposed. The machine was the answer to it." Olvahet considered this. The consideration was visible, not in any expression the metal face could produce, but in the precise stillness of the pause, the quality of attention behind the green-gold eyes. "An answer that persists," the Overlord said. "In considerable pain." The suit's pharmaceutical systems registered the observation to address the neurochemical response it produced before the neurochemical response could register as anything the Force would read clearly. Vader stood still in the light of his own blade and let the ventilator cycle twice before he answered. "Yes," he said. "Come," Olvaket said. "There are things you should see before we discuss what you want, and what I want, and what the Vault will permit." He led him through the deeper levels. Vader followed because the Force told him nothing useful about the corridors he could not see, and told him a great deal about he was walking, and because following a thing that commands 40,000 warriors in contained corridors is a form of wisdom, when the immediate tactical situation does not favor alternatives. The Overlord moved ahead of him with the smooth inevitability of something that had never needed to hurry, because it had never had an appointment it was required to keep, and the warriors they passed held their positions with the absolute stillness of systems in standby, and the vault opened around them in its 10 million year darkness. The sleeping dead filled every level. Millions of caskets, stacked in formations that served a geometric logic he could not immediately pass, each one sealed against time in a way that his suit's thermal sensors registered as absolute zero on their surfaces. Not dead, preserved. The distinction was one his suit's sensors could not fully capture, but the Force could thinly, across the corroded medium of this galaxy's energy field. Something remained in the caskets, not life. The echo of life, the preserved pattern of a self that had been transferred into a vessel not designed to hold the full dimensionality of a conscious being, and the pattern had held for 10 million years, and what it had lost in those 10 million years of holding was most of what had made the pattern worth holding in the first place. "Your people," Vader said. "What remains of them," Olvaket confirmed, "the form, not the rest." They walked in silence for a time through the corridors of the preserved dead. "You understand biotransference?" Olvaket said. "No, you will. It is not complicated. We were organic once, the Necrontyr. We were brilliant and short-lived and dying from the radiation of a star that hated us, and we were afraid of death the way organic things are afraid of death. And we were offered a solution that promised us everything we wanted: immortality, the end of the radiation sickness, the persistence of self across time. We accepted without examining what the solution required us to give." A pause, carrying the weight of 10 million years of a specific regret. We transferred our minds into metal. We kept our memories, our personalities, the patterns of thought that constituted everything we believed ourselves to be. We lost everything that made those patterns of thought worth preserving. Feeling, Vader said. Everything that feeling does, Olveket said. The capacity for loss, for hunger, for the specific weight of a morning when the light is right and you are in the company of someone who knows your name. We preserved the pattern and lost the ability to care whether the pattern continued. We became the memory of ourselves, and the memory is perfect, and it is insufficient. The corridor opened into the throne chamber. Olveket took his position before the throne but did not sit, because sitting implied a rest that 10 million years had made irrelevant. I offer you completion, Olveket said. The green-gold eyes met the red lenses of the mask without flinching, because flinching was an organic response. Full transference, the pain ends, the flesh ends. What you are becomes permanent in a way no suit can replicate. You would not rust, you would not hunger, you would not breathe with effort. The dark side of your force would need to be assessed, but the structural integrity alone. A pause. You would persist. Vader stood in the center of the chamber and let the force, thin and cold as it was, reach through the living metal around him for anything that would help him understand what was being offered. What it showed him was the caskets. Millions of caskets, perfect preservation, perfect silence, perfect absence of the thing that had lived in them. No, Vader said. The word fell in the chamber like a stone in still water. Olveket regarded him. No, the Overlord repeated, tasting the word. You choose the pain. I choose nothing you can offer me, Vader said. I will find my way out of this vault and take stock of where I am. The phase fields are active, Olveket said, without particular alarm. The awakening has begun, which your arrival triggered. I cannot reactivate the long sleep for the duration of a standard reorientation cycle. You have time. I suggest you use it to consider your options with more thoroughness than your refusal suggests. I have considered them, Vader said. He was reaching with the force beyond the vault as he spoke, stretching the thin cold current upward through 63 meters of compressed rock and 10 million years of sealed phase fields toward the pale bruised surface of Methion, and then beyond it, toward the orbital plane, toward something that had not been there before. Something descending, something that understood the force, or thought it did, or had built a frame of reference close enough to understand that an anomaly was present in the warp-adjacent frequencies above this dead world, and had decided to come down and examine it. Something is coming down from orbit, Vader said. Olveket's green-gold eyes brightened fractionally. My phase fields show nothing. Your phase fields detect warp resonance, Vader said. This is warp resonance, but the origin is different. It knows what I am, or knows what I carry. It has been moving toward this planet since my arrival. A pause, the ventilator cycling once. Whatever it wants, it is not your vault. Everything that comes to Methion is here for the vault, Olveket said, with a serenity of absolute certainty built over 10 million years. That is the nature of Methion. This will be different, Vader said. He was always right when the Force told him something was coming. Even in this galaxy, even with the Force running thin and cold and tasting of that vast corroded hunger below everything, some warnings were too large to miss. Meheket the Foretold descended in a drop pod that had been a Thunderhawk 2,000 years before the accumulated weight of chaos worship and sorcerous practice Ring Grandith had grown the vessel into something between machine and living thing, its hull plating breathing with slow respiration, its landing struts tipped with talons that dug into Methion's compressed surface and cracked it with sounds that carried across the dead world's silence like rifle shots. The rubric Marines who emerged after him moved in the perfect silence of things that had forgotten how to make noise voluntarily. Blue and gold ceramite carrying the dull geometric intensity of the Thousand Suns Legion as it had become after Prospero, after the rubric, after everything that Ahriman had done in the name of salvation, and had instead transmuted into something that no longer required saving, and no longer quite required anything at all. Dust lived in the rubric Marines. Dust and the ghost echo of personalities that had existed once, and now served as directing principles for the ceramite that surrounded them. Maheket was different from his marines, in the way fire is different from the ash it produces. He walked at their head in robes that moved in a wind that did not exist on Methion's windless surface. His third eye open beneath the horned helm, the warp sight it provided reading the resonance that had drawn him across 3 sectors, and through a warp translation that had taken 3 days of ritual preparation to stabilize. The resonance was strong here, stronger near the surface than he had anticipated, which meant the source was below. Which meant, as the phase field reading had suggested before it went quiet, the vault. He had come to Methion twice before. Both times the phase fields had repelled him at the boundary, with the absolute finality of technology that did not negotiate and did not reduce. He had spent decades building toward a third attempt, had sacrificed 14 of his original rubric marines to rituals designed to reveal even the surface of Methion's phase architecture clearly in the skein of fate. And now the phase fields were down. Now the vault was open. Now something had accomplished in an hour what his 60 years of preparation had never managed. He did not question this. He noted it and followed it. The phase fields let him through. He descended through the surface aperture that had iridesed open without resistance, and the lack of resistance told him that the vault's controlling intelligence had permitted his entry, which meant the vault's controlling intelligence had reasons that he could not immediately pass, and he filed this to watch carefully. He found them on the 3rd level, the man in black armor and the ancient metal king. Maheket stopped at the corridor's entrance and studied the man in black with every perceptive faculty he had developed across 60 years of warp practice, and what he found made him very still in a way that the rubric marines were always still, and that Maheket almost never was. The resonance was exactly as the skein had shown him. The connection to the outside warp power field was real, and it was strong, and it was purer than anything he had encountered in 10,000 years of the Long War's relationship with psychic power. A connection without the warp's corruption, without the gods' interference, without the cost that every psyker in this galaxy paid for their gifts because the gifts were borrowed from something that intended to collect. This connection drew from somewhere else entirely, and the being that carried it had been using it for decades with the practiced ease of something that had never known any other way to move through the world. It was the most perfect tool he had ever seen, and it was standing in a Necron tomb having a conversation with a Necron overlord. "Well," Maheket said, allowing his voice to carry the precise tone of a scholar encountering an exceptional find. "What an extraordinary morning." The man in black turned to him, and Maheket felt the resonance shift, the outside warp connection pulling taut like a bowstring being drawn by someone who had done it 10,000 times, and the red blade that ignited in the man's hand cast its light across rubric marines who did not react, and Necron warriors who did not blink, and an ancient overlord who watched all of this with the patience of a thing that had decided to observe rather than intervene, for now. "You are the thing that came down from orbit," the man in black said. "I am Maheket the Foretold," the sorcerer said, "and let the name settle. I have walked the skein of fate for 60 years in pursuit of the resonance you carry. I apologize for the abruptness of the introduction. The social framework for this encounter was not one I could locate in advance." "You cannot have what you came for," the man in black said. Maheket smiled behind his helm. "You do not know what I came for. You are a sorcerer. You want my connection to the Force as an anchor for a ritual." The red blade held its position in a guard that was simultaneously defense and invitation, a stance trained past conscious execution into pure reflex. "You cannot have it. Not willingly." "Then let us discuss the alternatives," Maheket said, and raised his left hand, and the warp opened behind him like a door kicked off its hinges. Warp energy does not enter the physical world gently. It tears, and the tear bleeds reality at its edges, and what comes through is shaped by whatever is close to the surface of the immaterium at the point of breach. What lived near the surface above Methion was old and geometric and cold, sentient fire, structured into calculated malice, and the first construct that pushed through the tear was all geometry and burning purpose. its form leaving mathematical patterns in the air that lingered like smoke from a fire that had never been made from wood. Vader moved before the construct had fully emerged. He moved the way things move when they have stripped decades of unnecessary motion from the action of violence, when the body and the will and the power that serves the will have become one continuous instrument with no gap between intent and execution. The red blade described an arc through the construct's geometric center, and the burning mathematics scattered, and the construct's coherence failed, and what had been a Sentient fire being destabilized into the residual warp resonance that fills air when something dies in it and leaves nothing else behind. The Rubric Marines moved forward in flanking formation. Vader turned. The force was thin. Thinner than it had been, because Mahaket's warp workings had introduced active warp resonance into the vault's environment, and the resonance was interfering with the force's conductivity, the way atmospheric distortion interferes with a targeting lock, degrading precision and requiring more power for less effect. He noted this the way he noted all tactical constraints and recalibrated without slowing. The lightsaber required no force to function. He could work with the lightsaber. He took the first Rubric Marine's arm at the joint between pauldron and upper arm assembly, and the limb separated with the clean finality of plasma cutting through ceramite designed to stop bolter rounds and energy blasts of a specific power range. The thing inside the armor, the animating dust of what had once been a warrior of the Thousand Suns Legion, attempted to compensate by redistributing its presence into the remaining extremities, a response that the Rubric Marines had been making for 10,000 years, because the response was all they had left. The second cut found the neck joint. The third cut found what remained. The animating principle departed with a soft luminescent dissipation, and a pile of very expensive ceramite occupied the space where a Rubric Marine had been. The second Marine fired. The bolt of warp fire struck him in the center of his chest, and he staggered 3 steps. The suit registered the impact as a Class 3 event, damage to the outer chest components, no penetration of the life support systems. He did not fall. The dark side of the Force, thin as it was running in this galaxy's corroded medium, still answered the demand for stability, with enough force to keep him vertical when the physics of the impact would have sat him down. He closed the distance on the second Marine. Above them, Mahaket watched and recalculated. The outside warp connection was harder to separate from its bearer than the skein had suggested. The bearer was more physically resilient than his apparent configuration implied. The Rubric Marines were being engaged simultaneously by Necron warriors who had materialized from the walls at the Vault's defensive matrix command, and the tactical situation was deteriorating with a speed that Maheket assessed as requiring a different approach. He tried the ritual. He built it fast, because 60 years of practice had made fast construction his minimum competency, drawing the confinement architecture in warp fire in 3 dimensions. A cage designed to flood a psychic entity's connective bandwidth with more warp resonance than the entity could process simultaneously, collapsing inward as the resonance built. It worked on daemons, it worked on psychers, it worked on everything that drew power from the warp, because everything that drew from the warp was ultimately subject to the warp's authority, and the confinement ritual was a statement of that authority. Vader felt it close around him. He felt the Force thin to almost nothing inside the ritual's perimeter, the warp resonance jamming the connective frequency, the way a signal jammer drowns a communications channel in competing noise. He felt the ritual tighten, begin its inward compression, and he reached for the Force with the specific discipline of someone who had spent 4 decades learning to work at the edge of what the Force would give him. What he found was not nothing, it was a single thread. One thin current running below the frequency the ritual had been built to intercept. A foundational layer that Mahaket's 60 years of Sentient practice had never encountered because it was not a warp current at all. It did not run through the warp. It ran through something else, something that predated whatever it was this galaxy's version of the Force had become, and it ran below the ritual's interference pattern the way ground current runs below atmospheric disturbance. He pulled it. He pulled it with everything he had, pouring 63 meters of compressed rock crash survival and 4 decades of dark side practice into a single sustained demand, and the thread answered. The confinement ritual shattered outward. The backlash rolled through Maheket's warp constructs like a shockwave through water, and the sorcerer's third eye snapped shut in pure self-protective reflex as the feedback hit him through the channels that connected him to the ritual's architecture. He lost consciousness for approximately 2 seconds. In a combat environment, 2 seconds is measured in outcomes. When his third eye opened again, the man in black was on the vault ceiling above him, the red blade already descending, the force choke closing around Maheket's throat with a grip that his warp armor could not fully intercept, because biology resists that kind of enhancement, and he was still beneath 10,000 years of sorceress practice, biological. He gauged. His concentration shattered, and the rubric Marines lurched as the Gestalt link that had been directing their coordinated movements degraded into individual threat response protocols. Vader descended from the ceiling. He held the force choke with the precision of long practice, the exact pressure required to prevent functional resistance without triggering the unconscious defense reflexes that came with genuine suffocation. Maheket was still conscious, barely. His third eye was wide and reading everything and finding the reading insufficient to save him. The ritual, Vader said, describe it. Maheket described it, not because he chose to, because the force choke was interfering with the neural pathways that his psychic defenses required for active suppression, and the choice of whether to speak had moved to a level upstream of where those defenses could operate. He described a dimensional anchor ritual, using the Force's outside warp connectivity as a stabilization point to punch a permanent corridor through the cicatrix maledictum from the Chaos-occupied side, a passage that would not close and would not require ongoing ritual maintenance and would give the Long War's forces a permanent lane through the Great Rift that the Corpse Emperor's servants could not seal. The corridor requires a sustained open connection, Maheket said, from within the grip of the choke, held at a threshold that a biological anchor cannot survive. You would have killed me, Vader said. Yes, Maheket said with the honesty of someone who no longer had the option of anything else. Why through the maledictum, Vader said. What is on the other side that matters that much? The sorcerer's third eye met the red lenses of the mask, and the answer took through the grip of the force choke with the flatness of a statement that had been true for so long it had lost all weight. The same thing everyone in this galaxy has always wanted, Maheket said. A way out. Vader released the choke. Maheket went to his knees, pulling breath in great controlled pulls, his third eye still tracking the man in black with the involuntary professional attention of someone who could not stop assessing a threat even in the immediate aftermath of being defeated by it. Ulveket spoke from the doorway of the chamber, where the Overlord had positioned himself to observe. I note, the Overlord said, that the Sorcerer's forces have destroyed 11 of my warriors and damaged 3 of my destroyers during this engagement. I am prepared to permit his departure to prevent further damage. I am not prepared to permit it without a cost. Maheket looked at the Necron Overlord. His third eye read the absolute warp null signature of the ancient Metal King, the complete absence of psychic resonance that the Necronter had sealed their entire race into 10 million years ago, when they transferred themselves into living metal. And what he found in that absence was something worse than any active threat. It was total, it was permanent, and it was currently evaluating him with the patience of something that had survived everything the galaxy had thrown at it for 65 million years, and expected to survive whatever he might attempt as a matter of geological certainty. What cost? Maheket said. You came for data, Ulveket said. You leaved without it. You leave knowing that the Vault's phase fields now hold your resonance signature. The next attempt you make to enter Merathion's lower atmosphere will be your last. I offer this as information, not as a threat. A threat implies I require a response from you. I do not. A long pause. Acceptable, Maheket said. He gathered what remained of his rubric Marines with a gesture that required no words, because words were not the mechanism by which Rubric Marines received commands, and he walked toward the surface aperture, and Vader watched him go with the Force, stretched to its thin cold limit across the vault's interference, tracking the retreat, confirming that it was a retreat, and not the opening move of something more complex. The warp resonance Mahakhet had introduced began to thin as his active workings dissolved without his maintaining attention, and the vault systems began their cleanup of the warp-contaminated air in the corridors with the quiet efficiency of systems that had handled environmental breaches before and had protocols for it. The vault settled into the hum of its wakened state. Vader stood in the center of the throne chamber and looked at the throne, and at the Overlord standing before it, and at the millions of caskets on every level below and above this one, each holding the preserved pattern of something that had been alive once and now persisted in the specific form of persistence that the Necrontyr had traded everything else to achieve. "You could have used the sorcerer," Vader said, "as leverage against me." "Yes," Ulvakhet said. "Why did you not?" The Overlord's green-gold eyes held him across the chamber, and the pause that followed was the kind of pause that only things with 10 million years of practice produced, genuinely considered, without performance. "Because you chose pain," Ulvakhet said. "In 10 million years of watching my people lose the capacity to make that choice, I have not resolved whether that choice is wisdom or foolishness. You are a more interesting question alive and choosing than dead or surrendered." Vader said nothing for a moment. "I need to reach the surface," he said. "Yes," Ulvakhet agreed. "And from the surface you will need transit out of this system. The sorcerer's vessel is in orbit. The sorcerer's vessel will not serve you well," Ulvakhet said. "No," Vader agreed. "I have tomb ships," Ulvakhet said, "sealed in suborbital platforms, dormant until the awakening, accessible now. I am prepared to provide one, in exchange for something you can give that I cannot otherwise acquire." "Information," Vader said. "Yes," Ulvakhet said. "You know what I want to understand." The ventilator cycled. "I will tell you everything," Vader said. They went to the surface. The pale, bruised light of Methion's distant sun fell across living metal and black armor as they emerged from the surface aperture, and neither of them spoke for a time. The dead world stretched around them in every direction, its flat compressed plains and its geometric silence, and its sky that held no weather and offered no comfort. And the Force ran slightly less thin up here, slightly less corroded at the edges, the open air giving it marginally more room to move. Vader spoke. He had not spoken of these things in order before, had told fragments in situations that required it, and had otherwise kept them filed in the place where things are kept when they are too precise in their pain to handle routinely. He told the Overlord of Tatooine, of a boy who had felt the Force like sunlight through clean water in every particle of every living thing on a desert world that had no reason to be beautiful and was beautiful anyway. He told him of Palpatine's patience, the decades-long design that had moved him across a galaxy like a piece on a board, appearing to offer guidance and offering instead the very specific shape of the disaster it had been preparing all along. He told him of Padme. This was the hardest part, and he told it to the dead air of Methion with the precision he brought to everything, naming each thing exactly: the marriage, Coruscant, the visions, the specific terror of losing the person who constituted the center of everything worth having. He told it the way a man tells the thing that he has carried longest, not with grief because the suit would not permit the full expression of grief, but with the accuracy that was the only form of tribute he could still offer. He told him of Mustafar of the table, of the suit closing around him like a decision that someone else had made about what he would be for the rest of his existence, and the first breath, the first metronomic mechanical breath, and the Emperor's voice in the moment after, and the word rise, and what rose. Ulvakhet listened to all of it with the stillness of a thing that had spent 10 million years listening to nothing, and had not lost the capacity. When Vader finished, the dead air of Methion held the silence for a long time. "You chose the pain," Ulvakhet said, "because there was nothing else left." "Yes," Vader said. "And you continue to choose it." "Yes." "Why?" The ventilator cycled twice. "Because," Vader said, "the pain is the last proof that something worth mourning existed." Ulvakhet went very still. The green-gold eyes held something in them for a moment that was not quite expression, but was the structural echo of expression, the preserved pattern of a self that had known how to be moved by something, and had kept the pattern even after losing the capacity for the experience. That, Ulvocet said slowly, is either the most human thing I have ever heard or the most foolish. Yes, Vader said. Ulvocet looked at the sky. I will tell you, the Overlord said, what this galaxy is, what it has been, what it is likely to remain. You will need to understand it before the tomb ship's navigation systems can be of any use to you. And Ulvocet told him. He told it with the thoroughness of a mind that had been present for it all, that had watched from the sealed dark of a dead world, as the galaxy's long catastrophe played out across the centuries of the Vault's long sleep. The war in heaven that the Necrontyr had started against the Old Ones 65 million years ago. The war that had turned the warp into a mirror of the species' capacity for violence and suffering, and had birthed the Chaos Gods in the overflow of that mirrored anguish, the long sleep, the awakening, the Imperium of Man, rising from old night in the form of an immortal psyker of staggering power, who called himself the Emperor, and built a civilization on the foundation of his own will and sustained it, in the end, through 10,000 souls a day sacrificed to keep his dying body functional enough to hold the Astronomicon lit against the dark, the Horus Heresy, the Long War, the Cicatrix Maledictum tearing the galaxy in half along the wound that the Eye of Terror had been trying to open since before humanity reached orbit, the Tyrannid fleets coming from the dark between galaxies, hungry in a way that was not the hunger of gods but the hunger of biology, more terrifying in its simple completeness for being entirely without philosophy. He told it without sentiment and without self-justification, including the Necrontyr's role in the origin of everything, which was the one part of the history that the Overlord delivered with something approaching the tone of a being that had spent 10 million years with a specific weight, and had decided that a weight named was a weight marginally lighter. Vader listened to all of it. When Ulvocet finished, the sky of Methion held the same pale bruise it had always held, and the dead world made no comment on what had been said about it or around it. The Emperor, Vader said, the one on the golden throne. He sustains his empire through pure suffering and has not spoken in 10,000 years. By the closest definition of both terms, Ulvocet said, yes, and the empire runs in his name, in his authority, on the memory of what he was. It has done this for 10,000 years, Ulvocet said, and will continue in some form for as long as the Astronomicon holds. The ventilator cycle, an emperor who serves his empire through pure suffering, Vader said, who cannot speak, cannot act, cannot choose. Yes, Ulvocet said, I understand that, Vader said. They stood in the pale bruised light, and neither of them added anything to it, because there was nothing to add that the statement itself had not already contained. The tomb ship rose from the suborbital platform on phase drives that produced no thermal signature and no exhaust. A vessel that existed simultaneously in real space and the phase space between real space and whatever the Necrons had mapped as their equivalent of transit medium. It was not large, it was sufficient. Its navigational systems carried star charts that predated the Imperium's founding by 65 million years, updated through the Vault's passive monitoring of the galaxy's celestial mechanics during the long sleep, and they could take him out of segmentum obscura and into the open void from which he could begin making his own assessments of where he was and what this galaxy's geography required of him. Ulvocet stood at the surface aperture. Lord Vader, the Overlord said. Vader stopped. The galaxy will attempt to categorize you, Ulvocet said. It always categorizes what it finds. The Imperium will decide you are a saint or a daemon, depending on which Inquisitor encounters you first and what mood they are in. Chaos will attempt to recruit you or consume you, likely simultaneously. The others will assign you to whatever framework makes your existence manageable. A pause with the weight of 10 million years of patience behind it. I recommend resisting categorization. It is the only freedom this galaxy has left to offer anything that thinks. And the pain, Vader said. Your conclusion. Ulvocet's green-gold eyes held him across the aperture for a moment that was precisely as long as the Overlord chose to make it. I had 10 million years to release mine, Ulvaket said. And I did not. So perhaps it is not foolishness after all, perhaps it is simply very difficult. The green eyes held steady. Or perhaps foolishness and difficulty are the same thing, most of the time. I have not resolved the question. You have given me new material for the consideration. Vader stepped into the tomb ship. The aperture closed behind him. Methion fell away below the phase drive's silent pull, the dead world returning to its geological patience, its ancient overlord standing on its surface, and looking up at nothing until the tomb ship stayed in phase space. And the tomb ship was gone from every sensor the vault possessed. Below the overlord's metal feet, 10 million former Necrontyr slept their dreamless sleep in their sealed caskets, the preserved patterns of selves that had traded feeling for permanence and found the trade insufficient. And the vault's systems ran their maintenance cycles with the quiet efficiency of something designed to outlast anything biology had ever produced. On the throne in the deepest chamber, growing slowly into its base over the centuries still to come, a seat that no one would sit in for another age of the world, waited with the patience of living metal. Maheket the Foretold, holding position in orbit above Methion, watched the phase signature of the tomb ship translate out of detection range and ran his calculations. The resonance was real. The bearer was resilient past expectation. The vault's defensive capability exceeded the Skane's assessment, which raised questions about the Skane he would need to address when he returned to the Eye of Terror. He turned the prow of his vessel toward the Eye and began the warp translation calculations. He was 60 years into a project. He would continue. On a vessel moving through phase space at speeds that predated the Imperium's understanding of movement, Darth Vader stood at a viewport that showed him the darkness of transit medium and thought about a metal king who had chosen immortality and found it hollow, and an empire that had been burning for 10,000 years in the name of an emperor who could no longer speak, and the chaos gods who fed on the galaxy's suffering and called the feeding a purpose, and the vast corroded hunger he had felt running below the Force in every corridor of every level of the vault, the thing that was not the warp and was not the Force, but occupied the space between them like a predator learning a new hunting ground. He thought about what he had told Ulvaket. The pain is the last proof that something worth mourning existed. He had not known he would say it until he said it. He had known it was true for decades without having the words for it, the way certain structural facts about the universe are understood by the body, long before the mind finds the sentence. He had worn the suit as punishment and as function, and as the daily cost of continuing to exist in the specific form that continuing had required, and underneath all of those framings, in the deepest place in the archive of himself, it had also been this proof that there had been a morning on a desert world when the Force had felt like sunlight through clean water, that there had been a person who knew his name before the machine. That loss of that magnitude was only possible in the aftermath of something irreplaceable. He thought about the Emperor on the Golden Throne. 10,000 souls a day. 10,000 years of silence. The cost of sustaining an empire paid in pure uninterrupted suffering by the being who had built the empire and could no longer speak to it. He did not feel kinship with the Emperor on the Golden Throne. He felt recognition. The phase space outside the viewport showed him nothing but the transit dark and the navigational systems of a vessel built 65 million years before his birth plotted his course through a galaxy he did not recognize toward an open void from which he could begin to learn it. There was no emperor here who had a claim on him. There was no rebellion here that had a claim on him. There was no Padme here. There was no Anakin Skywalker here. There was only this, the breathing and the dark and the thin cold Force, running through the medium of a galaxy that had been burning since before humanity reached orbit, and the specific fact of his continued existence, which was the fact that Mustafar had not finished what it started, and nothing since had finished it either. He was in a galaxy that had no good options, that had not had good options in 65 million years, that ran on necessity and suffering, and the particular stubborn refusal of things that had no reason to continuing. He was in a galaxy that would, when it found him, attempt to categorize him, he would not permit categorization. He had been the Emperor's fist and the instrument of a design he had not fully understood until he understood it too late, and he would not be anyone's instrument again. He had been Anakin Skywalker, and Anakin Skywalker was gone in the specific and irreversible way that things go when Mustafar happens to them, and he would not pretend otherwise. He was what he was, which was the thing that remained after those two things had been taken from him. And in a galaxy that had been burning for 65 million years, the thing that remained after everything else was taken was the only thing the galaxy had any use for. The tomb ship moved through phase space with the absolute silence of a vessel that understood silence as a fundamental operating condition. In the grim darkness of the far future, where 10,000 years of war had compressed humanity into something harder and colder than it had been, and where the gods of chaos ate the excess and called it worship, and where the Necrons dreamed their metal dreams of a self they could remember, but no longer feel, and where the hive fleets came from the dark between galaxies with the patient appetite of biology that did not require philosophy, a dark shape moved through the space between stars in a vessel that predated the Imperium by an age of the world. It breathed with the rhythm of a machine that kept a man. It carried a blade that owed nothing to this galaxy's metaphysics and a connection to a force that ran below this galaxy's corruption, and had not been broken by a crash that should have ended it, or a vault that had tried to offer it a way out, or a sorcerer who had spent 60 years trying to use it as a tool. It had said no, it would continue saying no, and somewhere in the corridors of the Vault Eternal, on the surface of a dead world at the edge of Segmentum Obscurus, an ancient king with green gold eyes looked up at the place where the ship had been and thought about pain as proof, and found for the first time in 10 million years that the question was not yet answered. It might, he considered, take some time. He was accustomed to time.